traditional healer with whom we have been working for the past many years. So, ladies and gentlemen, it's not working. Thank you. Before I start my talk, I would like to humbly thank the Lord God Almighty, the maker of heaven and earth, who has held my hand from when I was born and has brought me here. And I humbly declare that had it not been the Lord who was on my side, and I say it again, had it not been the Lord, I would not be here. And so for that reason, I want to particularly declare that my help is in the name of the Lord God Almighty. As you can see in this slide, it tells it all. There are many people who have held my hand along the way. And if this young man is not helped, there's no way he is going to go across that huge gulf which is separating him from the others. I have received help from an enormous number of people, and I wouldn't be able to appreciate every single one of them. And to those, I just say thank you for being there for me. My story begins in a town in Cameroon known as Bamenda. That is where I was born. And I was born to these two handsome and beautiful people here on the screen. And we call them Papa and Mommy. I loved Mommy so much. But at a very early age, we were told that Mommy had hypertension. And then I remember holding her and saying, Mommy, I'm going to find treatment for this disease. But somehow, she went through 3 strokes and didn't come out of the 3rd one. She died. But before she died, I was at university at the time she died. She called me and said, remember the promise you made to me as a kid. Don't forget it. So I set out trying to find a way of finding a cure for hypertension. How do I go about doing that? I would like to recognize 3 very special people in my life. The first one is Dr. Michael Nisome. Dr. Michael Nisome met me in the laboratory in the University of Yaoundé, where I was doing an honors program, abandoned to myself. I was just fumbling, going up and down, not knowing what to do. He was a veterinary student, and he asked me, I see you going to the lab every day. What do you go and do? I said, come and see. So every day we will go kill a rat, do the same thing, kill a rat, do the same thing. After 1 week, he asked me, how far are you with this project? Because I see you repeating the same thing every day. Can I design a research project for you? So I said, yes. Michael taught me research, and then we carried out the research project together. He taught me basic pharmacology, and then I wrote my dissertation, and that is how my journey in the research track continued. So without Michael, I might not have had the possibility of standing here today. I would also like to recognize Professors Woodewis and Norton. These were my doctoral supervisors. They were doctoral supervisors in the University of the Witwatersrand. And these are the people who introduced me to hypertension research. They were working on the genetics of hypertension. I remember once I said blacks. Professor Woodewis said, never you say that word again. There are no people who are black. They are people of African ancestry. So I learned that expression, and I have used it all along, and I get very irritated when you call me black. I'm not black. I'm a person of African ancestry. So I would like to go on with the presentation by taking us now to the title of my talk, which is, can I have a hand microphone, please? The title of my presentation, which is, Are Cardiovascular Diseases a Cause for Concern for People of African Ancestry? It's a question that often people don't really pay much attention to. But you go to the hospital and you're told that you are sick, you're this, you're that, but we do not really ask, what is the cause? Why do I have this condition? How can I prevent it in the next person or in my children? So before we delve into our conversation this afternoon, I would just like to introduce you to a few terminologies. When we say physiology, physiology just means a study of the functioning of an organism. How does it work? And then when we say human physiology, it is a study. It is a study of the entire human body with all the systems included. So physiology just looks at how the normal person functions, normality. But when it gets to disease, it's no longer physiology. So if you know what is normal, you're able to recognize what is abnormal. And then in the many systems that this human being has, there is one system which is described as the cardiovascular system. The cardiovascular system is the heart, the blood vessels, and the blood which flows in them. The function of the cardiovascular system is to carry blood through the body with oxygen and nutrients to supply the cells. And then once more, after having supplied, it picks out the waste and then takes it to the different organs that are responsible for disposing of this waste. So that is the function of the cardiovascular system. Then hypertension is one of the cardiovascular diseases, but before we get into hypertension, we should understand what it is. So hypertension is, hyper means too much tension, so too much tension in the blood vessels. But what is blood pressure, by the way? Blood pressure is that force with which blood hits or impacts the blood vessel walls when it is flowing through the vessels. So when everything is normal, physiologically fine, your blood pressure for an adult would be less than 140 millimeters over 90 millimeters of mercury. However, if it becomes more than this, then it is classified as hypertension. Generally, I know that the different hypertension societies have been revising this value downwards, but we work with this one. So hypertension then is a persistent raised blood pressure in an individual. That is now classified, that person is now classified as being hypertensive. Video, please. I just want you to look at this tap with the hose pipe. When the pressure is just normal, it flows without force. But when the pressure is high, as you increase the pressure, you can see this is a very powerful flow, which might destroy any object that is in front of it. That is how the blood vessels are. Blood flows in the blood vessels. When everything is physiologically normal, blood doesn't cause pressure. It just flows normally. But when an abnormality appears or happens in the thin layer of cells that lines the arteries or the blood vessels, known as the endothelium stops secreting nitric oxide. It is nitric oxide that causes the blood vessels to relax so that blood flows without pressure. But when nitric oxide is deficient, then it causes the muscles contract and the vessels become constricted, and then blood flows through now like a hose pipe under pressure. And it is now capable of destroying organs to which it supplies. And these are the cardiovascular diseases. Some of the cardiovascular diseases are because the pressure is very high. So with that background, I would like us to look at the prevalence of hypertension. Is hypertension important? It is very important because globally, more than 1.2 billion people more than 1.2 billion people, adults, suffer from hypertension. And of this number, 2/3 are in developing countries, and we are part of the developing countries. Important to also note is that more than 46% of those who are hypertensive do not even know that they are hypertensive. And only 42% of those who are hypertensive are on treatment. And for those who are on treatment, only 21% have controlled blood pressure. And when we say blood pressure is controlled, we are saying that this person is taking their medication faithfully, and the blood pressure is maintained under 140/90. That is controlled blood pressure. It will interest you to note that 1 in 4 adults in Africa suffers from hypertension. Hypertension is the leading cause for other cardiovascular diseases, even though it is in its own right a cardiovascular disease. I said hypertension is the most important cause for cardiovascular diseases, and it is in its own right a cardiovascular disease. And if we change the prevalence of hypertension, we also change the prevalence of cardiovascular diseases. If blood pressure is controlled, there will be very, very few incidents of cardiovascular diseases. So I selected a few risk factors for hypertension, and we have been investigating this, and I would address this in my next few slides. The first risk factor I would like to talk about is the genetic risk factors. I'm very sure you know of a person who has hypertension. If you ask that person if their mother or father had hypertension, the answer will be yes. And if you ask if their grandparents were hypertensive, they will say yes. So that immediately tells you that there is something about hypertension flowing through the family line. And then if you measure blood pressure of people, even the people from the same family, you would realize that some people's blood pressure will be higher, others would be lower. This variation in blood pressure measurement is determined by the genes. So this blood pressure is determined by the genes. Sorry for lagging, for going ahead and leaving my slides behind. There was a study that was carried out in the USA known as the Framingham study. It was over generations. So they recruited the parents, followed them until they had children. The children were followed up until they had children. That study showed that where the grandparent was hypertensive, the children were hypertensive, and the grandchildren were also hypertensive. And they also noted that if somebody developed hypertension before the age of 55, there was a very big risk that his children or her children will also be hypertensive. So with this background, I would like to delve now into genes because my PhD was on genetics of hypertension. So what are genes? We often say this is genetic and that is genetic. But before we can understand what genes are, I would like to remind you that as a human, you receive 23 pairs of chromosomes from your parents. And these chromosomes are lodged in the nucleus of every cell in the body. These chromosomes are made up of compacted DNA strands. And then the DNA is made up of a helix which winds around itself, and it has 4 sets of base pairs. We'll talk about that later. So any portion of DNA that codes for a given protein, that is what we describe as the gene. So it is not the whole thing which is a gene, it's just that portion which codes for a specific protein. So if we zoom into a DNA strand, the DNA strand is made up of the guanosine, cytosine, adenosine, and thymine bases. And they are complementary on the slide. If on this side you have guanosine, here you would necessarily have cytosine. And if somewhere you have adenosine, you will necessarily have thymine on the other side, on the complementary DNA. So it does happen that as genes are mixed during the fetal stage of life, some of these, there are changes. There might be mistakes which happen, and then you have, in the normal person, if you have a G in the normal person, in this person where there is a single nucleotide mutation, you will maybe have an A or a T. This is now known as single nucleotide polymorphism, which is generally known as SNPs. A SNP might cause a change in the protein that is produced, or it may not cause a protein change. If it causes a protein change, we describe it as being functional. If it doesn't cause a protein change, then it is non-functional. So we studied some SNPs during my doctoral program, and I will make mention of just a few. This is the sodium epithelial channel gene, the atrial natriuretic peptide gene, the angiotensinogen gene, the renin-angiotensin-aldosterone systems genes, and the stimulatory and inhibitory G protein genes. So the results, I have just summarized the results here, which show that some of these SNPs were associated with hypertension and other SNPs were not. By the way, before we got these SNPs to study them, in Africa we do not really fund research. So we wait for other populations to get into the genome and to pick up the SNPs which they think and they have studied and they're associated with hypertension. Then we try to replicate that kind of study in the African population to find out if these genes are also associated with hypertension in people of African ancestry. So I would explain 3 of the results that we had. The sodium epithelial channel gene is of importance because at that time it was reported that this gene was responsible for salt sensitivity in people of African ancestry. Salt sensitivity is when you take in salt and your blood pressure rises because you consumed salt. So, and because most Africans are salt sensitive, there was a claim that is because we have a mutation in this gene. And a study was carried out in the UK on 234 people, and those people of African ancestry who lived who lived in the UK, this population showed an association between this polymorphism and hypertension. So we decided to replicate that study in people of African ancestry living on the African continent and to see if these results were really the same. So in a population of 1,500 participants, we realized that the prevalence of this polymorphism was so low. In fact, among the 1,500 people, we had less than 40 people who had that polymorphism. So it is not associated with hypertension in people of African ancestry. It does not even affect the blood pressure. So then after this study, people stopped getting excited about this polymorphism. They forgot about it. It's now being used for other things. And then we also looked at the atrial natriuretic peptide genes. We looked at 2. One of them was slightly associated with hypertension, and the other one rather showed that that gene protects from hypertension. And then the inhibitory G protein polymorphism, which we studied, was not associated with hypertension. However, we realized that it modified the relationship between blood pressure and obesity. All participants who were obese, that is, we took overweight and obese, their blood pressure was much higher, significantly higher, than people who had the same homozygote alleles, but were lean. So it explains the fact that if you have the homozygous risk allele, and yet you are obese, you will be hypertensive, or your blood pressure will be higher. But if you have it and you're lean, the environment for that gene to cause raised blood pressure is absent, and so the blood pressure will be low. We also looked at how genetic polymorphisms can affect an individual's response to hypertension. So these were genes in the promoter region of the angiotensinogen gene, We looked at the -217 and the -20. Those who were homozygous for both alleles, they had the two risk alleles, they did not respond to ACE inhibitors. In fact, some of them had rather higher blood pressure when they took ACE inhibitors to treat hypertension. But those who had non-risk alleles responded adequately to ACE inhibitors as hypertension. Ladies and gentlemen, at this point, I'll just like to insist that you note this point because it brings out the fact that a personalized medicine is a must. Because if a person who has these risk alleles is put on ACE inhibitors by his doctor, this person will not have any benefits, or rather his life would rather be at risk. So highlights from the genetic studies show that the sodium epithelial channel gene polymorphism is not associated to hypertension in people of African ancestry, and that the inhibitory G protein gene modifies the relationship. So even if a polymorphism is not directly associated, it may be affecting other systems which are associated with hypertension. And then we also determined that genes may interact to determine response to therapy, and I am therefore focusing on African ancestry because when this same study was carried out in the Caucasian population, there was a very good response to ACE inhibitors, but not in Africans. So I now move to the next two risk factors that I made mention of, but I will put them together because it is difficult to discuss obesity without talking about hypertension. I remember when we were kids, it was very difficult to find another kid who was fat. Talk less of being obese. We were running all over the place, climbing trees, falling down, breaking a leg here and there. But there was no child who was fat or obese. But if you look at children now, the picture has changed completely. And a study that was carried out in Africa very recently showed that South Africa has the highest prevalence of obese children in Africa, up to 25%. Interpreting this is to say that 1 out of every 4 children is obese. So what is the impact of obesity on our population? And these studies were focused on children because we want to project to see how the future would be affected by these children who are obese. So I'll take you back to physiology so that we look at a few facts about obesity. Every person has some amount of adipose tissue. That is where the fat in the body is stored. However, when a person starts consuming more food than the body can burn, the rest of this energy is converted to fat. And when it is converted to fat, it is deposited in the body in one of two ways. The body may increase the number of adipocytes in order to store the fats in the increased number of cells, or the body may deposit these fats in the existing adipocytes and cause these cells to become bigger and bigger and bigger. Generally, in children, you would have this hyperplasia, this kind of fat, where the number of cells increases because they are still increasing, they are still growing. In adults, you generally have this kind of fatness, which is hypertrophy of the cells. The trouble with growing fat is that while the number of cells or the size of the cells is increasing, the blood supply does not increase correspondingly. So what happens then is if the blood supply, which is supposed to provide nutrients and to carry away waste materials, is not reaching to all the cells, then you have some cells which will suffer from hypoxia. Hypoxia is a state where cells do not receive sufficient oxygen. And because they do not receive sufficient oxygen for a prolonged length of time, what happens is that the cells die. And when the cells die, the body has its cleaning mechanism. In the adipose tissue, we have these macrophages which are resident, the M2 macrophages generally. These are the housekeepers. They watch to make sure that everything is well. If there's dirt, they just clean up and keep the place clean. However, when cells start dying, a new form of macrophages, which is known as the M1, comes in because they have to do the heavy duty. They would now surround the dead cells and try to digest it in order to clean the place. And as they do so, they release a lot of free fatty acids into the body. And they also release pro-inflammatory cytokines, which move the body from a restful state to a state which is ready for inflammation. And then the normal adipose tissue with those M2 monocytes, they secrete anti-inflammatory adipokines. So because more and more M3 macrophages are formed, the amount of pro-inflammatory cytokines will increase. What will happen is that as the cells are digesting as the macrophages are digesting the dead cells, they secrete substances which are known as monocyte chemoattractant proteins. These chemicals will get into the blood and cause more white blood cells to move out of the blood into the tissues in order to help clean up. So the large number of M1 macrophages will secrete more and more of these pro-inflammatory cytokines, and then the amount of anti-inflammatory cytokines will reduce. Then the body is now in a state of chronic low-grade inflammation. And while all this is happening, these cytokines which are released, they also start acting on the body, on the cells, causing them to release substances which are known as reactive oxygen species. Reactive oxygen species are free radicals. So what is oxidative stress, which is linked to oxidative stress, which is linked to the free radicals that have been released? Under normal circumstances, each element wants its external shell to be balanced so that it can be neutral. The external shell of the element should have 8 electrons. So these reactive oxygen species which are produced do not have 8 electrons. They always have less. So what they do is they grab electrons from normal tissues in the cell. So as they steal electrons, then these defenseless cells are more vulnerable. They steal more and more electrons, and the cell gets into a state where it no longer functions properly, and at the end, it will get damaged. I give you a practical example that I'm sure each one of us has seen. If you have ever cut an apple and didn't eat all of it and left it, oxidation starts immediately to break down the cells which are there. And if you allow it for a while, this oxidative stress will destroy the cells. These free radicals will attack more and more, and the cell will be destroyed, as we can see here. So, if I now try to put together inflammation, oxidative stress, and our topic of the day. So, obesity provides the right environment for inflammation to take place, and then inflammation will provide the reactive oxygen species, which will cause the body to get into a state of oxidative stress. And then these two, they perpetrate each other. More inflammation, more oxidative stress promotes inflammation. And then inflammation and oxidative stress, they act on the endothelial cells. Remember the cells I said line the inner layer of blood vessels. It affects them and causes them to release smaller amounts of nitric oxide. And as less amount of nitric oxide is produced, the cells, the blood vessels constrict, become smaller, and then the pressure under which blood flows become higher, and then we have hypertension. We have carried out a number of studies among children and adolescents in the Eastern Cape, and from our findings, I would just like to highlight some of the points that I have been discussing. We found out that children as young as 8 years old had albuminuria. Albuminuria means the person is passing out albumin in their urine. This is a sign of the fact that the kidneys are not in very good condition. We also found that the children were overweight and obese, about 33%. We also found that there was some hypertension. So if you look through this slide, you see the prevalence of hypertension and obesity is quite high. So if the prevalence of obesity is high, remember what we talked about, the fat adipose tissue, how it is able to promote high blood pressure. So we, after determining that the prevalence of hypertension of obesity was very high in children, we decided to check on the measurement values, on the standards which is being used. Is the standard correct? Or are we using wrong measurements to determine whether our children are obese or they are lean? So we decided to design a study which will look into that. And before I go there, I just want to show you how children are classified as obese or lean. When a child's weight has been measured, you place the child on the balance, they are weighed, you take their height, and then we convert it to BMI, and then we convert it using a certain, there are software online which will convert that BMI to percentiles. Because for children, you do not just say BMI, it has to be a percentile among other children. So if a child's BMI is greater than or equal to the 95th percentile, that child is classified as being obese. If it is between the 85th to the 95th percentile, we say that child is overweight. If it is between the 5th to the 85th percentile, then it is healthy weight. But if it is under the 95th percentile, then that child is underweight, and you start thinking of malnutrition. So we looked through literature and we found a document in the WHO archives which stated that universal cutoff points for BMI and waist circumference are not appropriate for use worldwide, given ethnic or population-specific differences in disease risk for any particular anthropometric measure. However, there may be a general consistency in cutoff points for waist-hip ratio for predicting cardiovascular disease. So even the WHO acknowledges that the measurements of BMI that we may be using and the cutoff points may not be relevant to our populations. So we designed a study which was published in the journal Biology with a relatively very high impact factor. And we decided to test these cutoff values which are used to divide children between lean, obese, and overweight. So in this study, we recruited 1,144 children. And children, these are adolescents. It was from 13 to 18 years old of age. In the Eastern Cape, some were from around Alice, others from East London, some from Umtata and Libodi. And then we measured their blood pressure, we measured their BMI, and then we did some analysis using ROC analysis, because ROC analysis helps to show you whether there is a difference in what you're trying to compare. So because there are several measurements which are used for determining body size, we picked out waist height ratio, which is just one cutoff point for both adults and children, 0.5, and then we compared it with BMI to see if our values would correspond with WHO values. Our results show that when we looked at the cohort and we were using waist height ratio as our reference, the blood pressure, the percentile BMI for our children in the Eastern Cape was 85.2 and 95.2, that was the cutoff. And then when we separated the children into males, into males and females, we realized that, remember we are talking here about obesity. The level at which obesity can be distinguished in females was at 85th or 84.45 percentile. And the sensitivity of this test was at 90.7 and the specificity 8.7. This was the best that we could get at this level. And then for the males, it was at 80.75. But if you remember that what the table I showed you was saying that obesity can only be diagnosed when the BMI percentile is greater than or equal to the 95th percentile. And then we reversed it and used BMI as the cutoff, as a reference, and then, we used BMI as the reference, and then we measured if it affected waist to height ratio. And it came quite close, 0.84, which is close to the standard, which is 0.5. That was for the cohort. And then for the females, it was 0.84. For the cohort, it was 0.81. And then in the males, it was 0.49, quite close to the 0.5 cutoff point. However, you remember I just said when we used BMI, the cutoff value that we were getting was less than the 85th percentile to separate children from between lean and obese. So then if that is the value, are we sure that the measurements that we are making and the diagnosis that we are making of lean and obese, are they relevant to our population? We will be replicating this study in a nationwide study that the Childhood Hypertension Consortium of South Africa will be hosting from next year. They will be able to prove this point, but this is a preliminary result that we as WSU published. So the conclusion of this study was that children of African ancestries may require lower cutoff values than the 95th percentile, which is currently being used. We shall be confirming this result in 2023. So then, after having presented all these facts to you, I'll just like to ask again, are cardiovascular diseases a cause for concern in people of African ancestry? We have looked at the genetic predispositions and the increased risk for cardiovascular diseases, which I highlighted in the table. There's obesity, oxidative stress, low-grade inflammation, chronic low-grade inflammation, hypertension, and albuminuria, which we already find in children as young as 6. So, what does obesity do to a child? I remember that when in the early 70s, when a child was diagnosed with hypertension, I'm sure the physicians here will confirm with me that the treating physician will be restless trying to find out what is the cause, because it was thought children could not have hypertension, diabetes, or any of these so-called adult onset diseases. However, obese children also produce inflammatory cytokines, as we showed earlier. Their lipid metabolism is disturbed by that digestion of dead adipocytes releasing free fatty acids into the blood. And this induces endothelial dysfunction, and endothelial dysfunction may lead to atherosclerosis, which is a narrowing of the blood vessels by fat deposits and other things. Or it may lead to a constriction of the blood vessel walls because the nitric oxide production is low, and this leads to hypertension. And hypertension on the lung causes ventricular overload, which will cause the heart to grow bigger. And when the heart grows bigger, it has a propensity to fail. And on the other hand, obesity causes the renin-angiotensin-aldosterone system to become overactive. And when it's overactive, the child will be releasing more of these hormones, the norepinephrine. Remember, the fight and flight hormones are released in large amounts. This increases sympathetic tone in the blood vessels, and as a result, ventricular preload is increased. The heart works over time and will become hypertrophied. From our studies, I just want to highlight some of the risk factors. We talked about chronic low-grade inflammation. We tested that with high-sensitive CRP, and high-sensitive CRP, which is low-grade inflammation, was associated to obesity in the children. And we also showed that just air particles, the small air particles 2.5, 5, and 10, are associated with obesity in children in the Eastern Cape. We also show that pulse wave velocity, which is a measure of how compliant the blood vessels are, was high in the children. And we also measured something which we call a flow-mediated slowing. That is a direct measurement of endothelial function. And this was also associated with hypertension in the children in the Eastern Cape. We also looked at ADMA. ADMA is a marker for endothelial function and oxidative stress. They were positive in children and associated with blood pressure in children. We looked at albumin-creatinine ratio, which tells us that the kidneys are functioning well or not. It was also associated with hypertension in children. And then we looked at oxidative stress markers, and these oxidative stress markers were associated with hypertension in children in the Eastern Cape. So, after we've seen all of this in children, what do we think is the way forward? Or what awaits these children in the future? Obesity in children would generally track or cause cardiovascular diseases in children, as we can see now. I was very surprised when I went to see a physician friend in the hospital. He's a cardiologist, and they were running frantically, and I was asking what was the matter. He told me that a child of, I think, 12 years just passed away with heart failure. And so they were trying to get the child into the mortuary, autopsies, and so on. But that is our reality currently. And then pediatric cardiovascular diseases, if attention is not paid to them, will lead to adult cardiovascular diseases. Childhood obesity would generally track into adult obesity unless something is done about it. And childhood obesity may lead to metabolic diseases because of those free fatty acids which are released. And then we may have children who have type 2 diabetes and other metabolic conditions in adults. Is there hope for tomorrow's generation of African ancestry? I would say yes, there is hope. If we replace all the video games and the sitting and eating chips with some activity and get our children to trim down and to become lean, it will be an advantage because inflammation will be low, oxidative stress would be low, sympathetic tone will be normal, and this will lead to improved endothelial function. And if there is improved endothelial function, the blood vessels will not be constricted to cause raised blood pressure, which may cause hypertension, and then cardiovascular function generally will be improved in children. I also believe that Africa should solve African problems, and that we should stop running to the West all the time when we have problems. So what are some of the solutions that we have in our environment to the cardiovascular risk issue in people of African ancestry? Medicinal plants have been a part of our lifestyle. As far back as when I was a child, I remember my mom will boil these things and force me under a blanket and cover. I'll be crying and they'll be holding me down. But by the time you get out of that blanket, the fever is gone and the child is feeling better. But we have so far abandoned the traditional ways and abandoned our medicinal plants, forgetting the fact that 80% of the rest of the African population depends on medicinal plants for their health care. Could there be a solution to the African problem from medicinal plants? I started by introducing to you Mr. Matlakata, who has provided for us many medicinal plants that we have studied So, if you remember this flow diagram which I presented before, if we were to add to this diagram antioxidant plants, it would decrease oxidative stress. And if oxidative stress is decreased, the inflammatory cycle will not be perpetrated. And then endothelial function will be maintained normal, and blood pressure will probably be normal. And then anti-inflammatory plants and hypolipidemic plants will influence inflammation, and then this would also go a long way in protecting the endothelial function, and as a result, blood pressure will be normal. So we worked with Mr. Mahlakata and others to have several medicinal plants which we tested for the different properties that I presented just now. So we had hypolipidemic properties. You will be happy to know that marula, the skin of marula, has hypolipidemic properties. And then we also looked at this other plant, Atraxia, and we looked at this one. This is raffia, the raffia fruit. Back at home, yeah, we forgot something. Yeah, back at home, we call this ankop, and it is just consumed generally. We just consumed it as kids for fun. But then it has antioxidants and may be useful in lowering blood pressure. And then this is the king of the plants. My family brought a few from home, and I was planning to bring them here, but with the rain and all the confusion, we forgot. So I have the plants. For those who would be interested in it, we shall talk later, but I will not give to Prof. Sone, who is nodding so emphatically, because he knows the plant. Okay, so these plants, they all showed hypolipidemic properties, meaning that it decreases the lipids in the blood and may be useful for weight loss. We also studied several plants with anti-inflammatory properties. The most common of them is chamomile. There's chamomile tea that we know when you want to relax a bit at night, you take it. And then we also have lemongrass, which also showed anti-inflammatory properties. Then we studied plants for antioxidant properties, and it will interest you to note that the humble dandelion, which grows in your driveway every day and you keep uprooting and throwing, has enormous potential as an antioxidant plant and an analgesic as well. Okay, we studied antihypertensive plants. This is where Mr. Mahlakata comes in very strongly. And we showed that some of the plants which he provided for us had antihypertensive properties, protected the kidneys, and protected the heart. And some had, okay, raffia once more, had antioxidant and antihypertensive properties. I will now move into the side effects of some of the medications and endothelial dysfunction. Most often, I once found a man, I happened to be with some medical students in the hospital in Johannesburg at the time when I was a student. And there was this man in the hospital who refused categorically to take his antihypertensive medication. When we asked why, he said, Umama will kill him. So I was asking, why would Umama kill you for taking your medication? It was much later that I understood why Umama was going to kill him for taking his medication. So erectile dysfunction comes with endothelial dysfunction, because erection is just an action of the secretion of nitric oxide, which causes blood to gush into the phalloid and to present as an erection. So because endothelial function is compromised in these patients, most of them or some of them suffer from erectile dysfunction. So we studied this plant, which we call in Cameroon, in Cameroon we call it bitter kola. Bitter kola, I have some for anybody who wants to try it. So bitter kola is, it's not pleasant to eat, but you eventually get used to it. When you get used to it, you like the taste. So in Cameroon, it is consumed for indigestion, it's consumed for erectile function, it's consumed as an aphrodisiac, it is consumed just to keep your mouth fresh. So we studied it in rats, and we had female rats that we used estrogen to prime them so that they are receptive to the male. And then we treated the animals with these plants for a number of days, and then after that the male was introduced into the cage of the rats, and they were very aggressive. So the number of mounts was significantly higher after 24 days in animals that were treated with bitter kola. And then after 50 days, it was still significantly higher. And then for rats, when a rat mounts a dam, it has to, intromission has to take place. And the number of intromissions, we have a way of measuring that, was also very significantly higher in treated rats than in rats that were not treated. We also showed that the ejaculation function was higher in treated rats than in the other. And here we also looked at the hormone level in the treated and in the non-treated rats. So, in conclusion, ladies and gentlemen, I would like to say that there is enough evidence that points to the fact that a person can be predisposed to hypertension because of their genetic pool. And then there is also evidence that from children's study that there's several risk factors which will normally cause hypertension are found in children. And because these are found in children, it is a cause for concern. Then there's a high prevalence of obesity and hypertension already in the children. We know that obesity creates the environment for oxidative stress and inflammation, and the increasing prevalence of raised blood pressure among children, which shows that, as I showed in the previous slides, if not controlled, will track into adulthood. And there's evidence that childhood obesity and hypertension track into adulthood. So, are cardiovascular diseases a cause for concern for people of African ancestry? I think you'll be able to answer that question for yourself after this presentation. This presentation and all this work would not have been possible without the able help of Dr. Engwa, Dr. Ndlovu, Dr. Oniche, and Dr. Wemidu, who are postdoctoral fellows past and present. And then my postgraduate students, PhD. Thank you. Okay, PhD and master's degrees. I could only find the most recent ones. So these are their photos, and they are all graduates from WSU. And then I'd also like to recognize my current postgraduate students who contributed a lot to putting the booklet together. And then I would like to recognize some very distinguished researchers who have helped me so far. There's Professor Haira, there's Professor Goswami, Professor Sewani Rusike, Prof. Mutawung, and then Dr. Schmidt Zaludek, Professor Stezel, and Professor Fredrickson. I would also like to acknowledge my family. in a very special way. My husband, Dr. Chungak, took care of these boys when they were babies, and I left for Johannesburg to study. In fact, this boy was 7 months old at the time when I left. And Mrs. Ngameni, who was here, was wiping my tears all the time because I just cried, and I just cried. But I think it was worth it all at the end of the day. I am grateful for the family. This is our first boy. He should be somewhere here in the room, there at the back. He is a graduate of Walter Sisulu University. He graduated from the MBCHB program and is practicing in Johannesburg. Then Benjamin is in NMU. Paul is in the medical school here in WSU. And then Joseph is studying engineering in Austria. Then I would like to thank my family again for making it all the way here. This is my older brother, a retired soldier, and this is his wife, Maros. This is my younger sister, as you can see, and this is her husband. I'm sure you have seen me with 3 little girls, or 2 little girls. These are their parents. I cannot end this presentation without thanking some people. Professor Albert Kamani and Professor Bopele. These are the people who were responsible for assisting me to have a doctoral fellowship from the then Third World Academy of Science, which is now known as the Organization for Women in Science of the Developing World. They funded my studies in Johannesburg. And then I would like to thank Professor Iputu for believing me when I was very doubtful of myself when I joined WSU. And then Prof. Sewani Rusike, I would like to thank her for all the help she's been to me. Prof. Sinkala has been a very near help at all times. I would like to thank Professor Oyedeji for assisting me with my rating, my first rating application, and also for pushing me to do research at a time when I was slowing down. I'd like to thank Professor Nandu Goswami for encouraging me to go on with cardiovascular disease research in children, because I was wondering whether I should abandon it and get into medicinal plants or what should I do. But he encouraged me to stick on. I want to acknowledge the National Research Foundation and the South African Medical Research Council for supporting me. And there is a special person here, Mr. Funani, who is my PA. He runs around quite a bit to assist in these research projects. And then there are many others whose names cannot be mentioned here. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Professor Nke. May we please give her another big round of applause. Thank you very much. Before I call upon the academic respondent, let me invite my colleagues to come back on stage. Whilst they are coming, you can take your seat. Whilst they are coming, you will agree with me, ladies and gentlemen, that we have learned a lot today. And what I like most, I will not hear anybody calling me a black person, but someone of African ancestry. I'll have to start with my grandson. He has 2 grandparents, grandmothers, it's me, and the one, my daughter's mother-in-law. He has a special way of distinguishing between the two of us. He says he has a white guinea and a brown guinea. That's how he distinguishes. So I will start with him. The body steaming was very serious during the time of COVID. What your mother told you to do when you were young, we were doing it seriously during the time of COVID. We've learned a lot about hypertension. Over to you, Professor, to respond. I'm using this one and this one.
Thank you very much, Madam Program Director. Thank you very much. Good afternoon. I would like first to thank the professorial lecturer who was just giving us. And also, I would like to mention that we have been always fighting when I say a black person. She will always say, no, I don't want to hear this. I say, why? So today, actually, I've learned why she was always against this word of a black person. Thank you very much again. Can we just put up a round of applause by doing, I'll show you how to do. I'll show you how to do. Just be patient. Just be patient a bit. I would like us to do. Okay? Let's go. Thank you very much. Yeah. You'll excuse me, my eyesight is a bit blurred, so I might be a bit slow on reading. Your Honorable the VC, Professor Esonga, the DVCs, Professor Davana Maselesele and Jaka, the rectors, Professor Sisha and Francis Kwahene, the dean, Professor Mbukazi, and other deans in presence. The Cameroonian High Commission, and also all distinguished guests and ladies and gentlemen. It is my pleasure and feel much more honored to stand before you in response to this Professorial Inaugural Lecture of Professor Benedicta Nke Chungang. Honorable VC and all distinguished guests, I have known Professor Benedicta Nke Chungang for the past 8 years through her articles and publications on the use of traditional herbs in the treatment of cardiovascular diseases and diabetes rather than on the use of modern medicines, but we became more closer since I joined Walter Sisulu University 3.5 years ago. We are working together in the multinational research project on COVID-19, and it is complications in people affected by hypertension, cardiovascular diseases, and diabetes. Our relationship is even more strengthened with the current work that we are doing on the establishing a research collaboration network involving 6 institutions of higher learning in the SADC region. Currently, actually, we were in Tanzania in terms of this, what I'm talking about. And we were supposed to be in Zambia, but due to some logistical issues, we were not able to be in Zambia. Honorable VC and all distinguished guests, in her inaugural lecture, the professor discussed on the aspects of the genetic determinants of hypertension in people of African ancestry, where she shared an interesting finding on the functional variants of the SAGT gene contributing towards the variability of ABP responses to AACE therapy in patients of African origin. Patients with at least one copy of both 217 G2A and 20A CRL developed a substantial decreases in ABP. She then went on to talk about hypertension and cardiovascular risk in South African children of African ancestry, where she pointed out that cardiovascular risk factors, including obesity, metabolic syndrome, oxidative stress, and microalbuminuria, are prevalent and associated with hypertension and vascular dysfunction in South African children of African ancestry. She also then touched on how obesity may be associated with inflammation, oxidative stress, and cardiovascular diseases, where she concluded that obesity and overweight are therefore two conditions which increase the risk for hypertension and cardiovascular diseases through chronic inflammation and oxidative stress. Honorable VC and all distinguished guests, I was more impressed by what she shared with us on the analgesic and anti-inflammatory properties of medicinal plants, where she mentioned medicinal plants are also useful for the treatment of pain and inflammation related conditions in people with overweight and obesity. Honorable VC and all distinguished guests, the professor went on to talk on the use of medicinal plants in hypertension and metabolic syndrome, which collaborates with several studies that medicinal plants can be used in the treatment of hypertension and diabetes without causing any harmful effects on the patients. For instance, work done by Hemophilia, who also showed that medicinal plants can potentially be used to protect neonates against obesity and metabolic syndrome. Honorable VC and all distinguished guests, the professor shared her work on studies of erectile dysfunction, which were conducted in male animals. In these studies, she mentioned that G. coli showed potential effect for the management of erectile dysfunction in males and could contribute to the prevention of cardiovascular diseases. For this, I think you should make a pilot for humans, and I will be your first candidate. Honorable VC and all distinguished guests, there is no doubt that hypertension is linked to genetic preposition, although genetic factors explain the differences in blood pressure levels. Studies have shown that genetic factors alone cannot explain the occurrence and severity of hypertension and cardiovascular diseases in this population. Recent research has shown a strong link between obesity and overweight and oxidative stress, along with chronic low-grade inflammation. Chronic low-grade inflammation results in endothelial dysfunction, which is the first step towards the development of cardiovascular diseases. Overweight and oxidative stress have become rampant in people of African ancestry. Honorable VC and all distinguished guests, in her summary, we have learned that to prevent increasing burden of hypertension and cardiovascular diseases in people of African ancestry, the following should be taken into consideration. People of African ancestry must live more active lives and consume more vegetable and fruit-rich foods. African medicinal plants, which are currently used in traditional healers, may provide a situation for the prevention and management of hypertension and related complications. Finally, scientific studies and trials would further assist with quantification, dosage, response, and management of side effects and complications. With this, I would like to say, asante sana, thank you very much, siyabonga, merci.
Thank you very much, Prof. Only academics like yourself and Professor Mashudu and very few in this auditorium can respond to the address. As the address was given, I kept on looking at my colleagues. Some were saying, oh, ainzima kele. And I could see Professor Mashudu keeping on nodding because it was a language she understood. Before calling upon Professor Jabu Mbokazi for a congratulatory message, I want us all to acknowledge the presence of the traditional healer, who has played the very most prominent role in the research that is conducted by Professor Nke and her research team. And when I ask you to give him a big round of applause, I want to say, Makhosi. Professor Mbokazi, can you come forward for the congratulatory message?
Thank you, Chair. Madam Vice Chancellor, Deputy Vice Chancellors, Rectors, Deans, ranking officials of the university, distinguished guests, ladies and gentlemen. It is a pleasure for me to read this congratulatory message. For Professor Benedicta Kechungang. It is a pleasure, Professor, to be invited by you, for us to sit with you, and for us to face the audience with you. And why this is most important is because you are the first one. You are the first one to give these inaugural lectures. your name will go down in history. This institution will never forget you. And none of us will forget you. You are the first one. And therefore, this is unique for you, it's unique for us, it's unique for the institution, and it sends a message to all of us and to the upcoming academics that indeed they should reach this level. Now, Professor, you'll remember that institutions have got this habit. Once you are a full professor, you've given your inaugural lecture, now they will say, in future you'll be a senior professor. They keep on shifting. So we will keep on following you, Prof. Looking at your progress, monitoring your progress, because we are going far. You are going far. And as you showed us in the map, we are coming from humble beginnings, very humble beginnings. I've never been to Cameroon, but I would imagine that it is an African country in Central Africa, and it's a country that has got many problems. Like we know the problems that we're facing in African countries. But look at what you've done, Professor. Look at what you've done. You went to, let me start with university. We didn't hear much about school. We didn't hear about primary school or high school. Well, it doesn't matter because now you are a professor. We don't want to know that. We assume you went to primary school. But when you arrived at university, you are so focused. You are so focused. When I look at the chronology of you obtaining those qualifications, it was one after another. And soon after you finish your qualifications, they made you a lecturer. It means you were a determined young lady. You did not look this side or this side. I don't know where you met when you met your father of your children, because I always hear that people find their partners at university. So, but you are focused, Professor. Congratulations to you. And that's what I always say to my academics in the faculty, that, look, please pay special attention to first years and second years, because that's where we lose future professors. You find a bright student, comes into first year, he stumbles, loses hope, gets discouraged, and he disappears. And I keep on emphasizing this to everybody in the faculty, that please pay special attention to first years and second years. Because that's where the problem is. That's where we lose most of our professors who would have been professors. And when I look at the time you spent in those, just in 10 years, you're already doing your doctoral degree. And this is amazing. And this is a feat that many of us cannot achieve. And as I said, in between you started teaching. And I know that those professors would not have allowed you to stand in front of the students if you're not good, if you're not focused, if you're not under proper self-control and directed. And they realize that, no, you are good at your craft, you are good at what you are doing. And coming in this country, going to vets, most of us couldn't get to vets, well, for other problems, It was a white institution. We were kept outside. So you went to vets. And getting into those institutions is not easy. It's highly competitive. So you went there. And when I look at the years you spent to read for your PhD, it was a minimum number of years. Now, I also want to congratulate you for focusing on African problems. And as you said, the problem we face in Africa is that we can't do original research. We have to do research that has been done by others, and then they bring it here, and then we have to link with them, and then we get funding simply because we're doing what they've been doing. You can't just start and do, what I can call greenfield research, blue sky research. You can't do. Because they will tell you, no, you need to get a professor from Harvard to assist you. And there's not enough funds in Africa, to make sure that we can do our so-called blue sky research. I was reading an article by one famous professor, Professor Asimov, who used to work at MIT some years back. He wrote an article to say, how do people get ideas? How do you get ideas? Do you sit under a tree? Do you go and run? Do you take a bath? Or you go to the shebeen and drink and then get an idea? It's amazing that, these ideas come when you are sitting alone, when you are thinking hard, when you are following a path that you've decided that I'm going to follow this, like you've done, Professor Nke. So the issue of the other question, of course, if you listen to her presentation and the things that she has come up with, then you ask yourself, if we have so much knowledge, why are we suffering like this? There's a lot and lots of this research that is gathering dust in libraries in many countries here in Africa. The problem is that to get research into practice, especially clinical practice, it is hard, if not impossible. It is almost impossible to get research into practice. There are so many things that you have to go through. There are so many, hurdles. It's almost impossible. Why? It's because of many interests. Do you know that there's so many interests in the health of people, and some of those interests are legitimate, some are not legitimate. If you have a discipline, like in medicine, you have a discipline that emphasizes preventive medicine, you know that discipline will not take off. Will not take off because we are preventing. We are preventing. The money is in disease. Yeah, that's where the money is. Big pharma. In fact, in medicine, we are controlled by big pharmaceutical. They control us. They control us. And we can't get out of this, out of this circle of control. One product, they will tell you that bringing Panado to the market, we spent $1 billion. So you can't bring your own thing that, how much did you spend? So those are the interests that we're battling against. Those are the interests that are actually problematic for us. There is a qualification that they call, it's related to chiropractic, healthcare, but it's called osteopathy in the United States. They have their own medical schools in the United States. The problem is that they are using hands to try to treat diseases. They don't use medicine. So the support that they are getting is minimal. It's not there because they are not working with the pharmaceutical companies. That's where the problem is. Thank you very much, Professor, for bringing this to our notice. We saw the bins that you are showing us there towards the end. Those bins, I don't know whether they are bins or what. But we heard that they work in rats. In rats. We don't know whether they work in humans. Now, just one thing that I almost forgot. Some of you will be surprised why, as health sciences were accompanying here, is because hair discipline is a basic science which straddles these faculties. And there are several disciplines that are like this, like biology. It straddles both faculties. So they work together. And let me just say that this institution is very strong in physiology. That other year, in 2019, we hosted a big conference, a physiological sciences conference. And I see the organizer sitting there, one of the organizers who was running down. It was a huge conference in East London. So we're quite strong in the field that a professor here is researching on. I hope that that year that we have since 2019, after hosting that conference, we'll continue producing research like this. I want to congratulate you also for putting the university, the campus, and our faculties on the map. You've made linkages with many other universities, grass universities, and I wish you a long academic life, and thank you for bringing your family here together. Congratulations to them. You have a nice family. We saw your children here. You have nice postgraduate students. They are beautiful. We saw the graduates here. Congratulations, Professor. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Prof. Mbokazi. I know Prof. Mbokazi can go on and keeps us here. What I like in what you have said is that Professor Nke is the first one, which makes us as WSU women proud. Can we give a big round of applause? I don't know how she was selected to be the first one, but I have no doubt it's because the Vice Chancellor and Principal is a woman. Before inviting the DVC for a vote of thanks, allow me to make a few announcements. The first one is that it's not an announcement, this one. Professor Nke bumped into us yesterday, Mr. Kwayena and myself. She came for something else. And Mr. Kwayena said, Prof. Cishe, tell me what you're gonna be wearing tomorrow. I said, you know me, I will dress to kill. And she said, no dress to kill, but traditional attire. That's why the two of us are in traditional attire. Can you see him there at the back? We were instructed. We were instructed to be in traditional attire. That's why we are like this. The second one, after the occasion that when the procession has gone out, everybody is invited for a light meal at the foyer. And the very most important announcement, you see the banner on my right. This banner on my right, congratulating the professor. You may not see what is written at the bottom. Let me read everything. Professorial Inaugural Lecture by Professor Benedict Nke Chungang, Dean of the Faculty of Natural Sciences, Walter Sisulu University, South Africa, with her picture. She is dressed the way you see that picture without a headgear. At the bottom, congratulations to you for your achievements. We wish you God's guidance in the task ahead. Thanks to the family. That banner has been designed by the family. Thanks to the family. Dr. Chacha, can you come forward?
Good afternoon or good early evening, ladies and gentlemen. It is indeed an honor and a privilege to get the opportunity to propose a vote of thanks on this very special occasion. On behalf of the Vice Chancellor of Walter Sisulu University, on behalf of the Senate of Walter Sisulu University, and on behalf of the management, let me take this opportunity to thank all honorable guests and honorable attendees that have joined us in this occasion, physically as we are sitting here, and those who have joined online. Ladies and gentlemen, let me pay a particular gratitude to the High Commissioner of Cameroon for blessing us with your presence, for us, for taking time to come and join us in this occasion. It's really something that we are very, very thankful, and it's something that we'll cherish for a long time to come. Thank you very much, High Commissioner. Allow me to express sincere gratitude to the family and friends of Professor Nke Chungang for not only honoring this event, but for the support you have offered her every day, every week, every month, every year, and even every decade. Professor Chungang, everybody knows here within the university, is very energetic. It's a very calm person. It's a person who is always focused, always sober. And now we can begin to see
the support that you have given her, and we really appreciate it from the bottom of our heart. Thank you very much for that. Academic division, as well as the institutional support division of the university, thank you very much for the support that you give to all our academics within the university. That is the key. And this is the work that you have done. Professor Chungang here is one of those that you have supported and you continue to support. We really appreciate. And thank you very much, and we wish you to continue to do that for a long time. We really appreciate it. Thank you very much. Prof Nke, thank you very much for your academic leadership. It's written here and it's always indicated, one of the leaders within our university. Thank you very much for the work that you have done. Thank you very much for the leadership in the science exploration as you have done and you are experiencing today under the name of Walter Sisulu University. We really appreciate that. We are very thankful for you for agreeing to be the trailblazer in this area of inaugural lectures. It's something that, as it has been indicated, it is the first, and we really appreciate that you have agreed to be the first, and I'm sure a lot will follow, and we can actually see the energy that is here and the respect that we take this element of inaugural lectures. Thank you very much for the informative lecture. Professor Oyedeji, I learned today, of course, that epithelial sodium channel gene is not associated with hypertension on people of African descent. Thank you very much for clapping. Prof, we really need to talk. We really need to talk, especially men. When we are sitting there in the crawl, there are always things as and don't eat salt because it's going to cause. And that statement that you have said, we really need to talk outside here. But thank you very much for that. Vice Chancellor and your team, lastly, the team, it's everybody who have put this thing together under your leadership. First, thank you very much for this wonderful initiative. It's something that you have been driving. It's something that you have been talking about, that this is what you want. And this is, of course, going to be your legacy within this institution for something that we have come and we have assisted. And it's really elevating the academic within the university, that we are a university and the academic is at the forefront. It's at the top. This is the highest, and everybody must recognize that. Thank you very much, VC, for that. And thank you very much for your team. Thank you for that. For the team that have put all of everything together under the, of course, organized here within our Mthatha campus. I'm sure we'll still be going to other campuses when we're having things like this. Program director, you have done a good job. Thank you very much for that. Colleagues, I mean, everybody who have put this thing together, it was a good job. Thank you very much. I'm not going to mention you by your names. Thanks.
Thank you, Dr. Chacha. I saved this last announcement to be the last one. Maybe I knew that we were going to talk to Prof Nke. Professor Mbogazi, Dr. Chacha, I've seen the pills being given to Professor Nke. There are the pills, so you can start negotiating. May we all rise for the singing of the national anthem. I'm looking at the media. I'm checking if you have it, and if you don't have it, tell us, we'll be able to start. Are you leading us? Okay. It looks like there's a problem. Can we sing, those who can sing? I don't see Mrs. Damas. please remain standing whilst the procession leaves the hall. We will use the shortcut, starting with a VC. Prof, we use this one. It's fine, Prof, you can come that way. Yes, Prof, go. Forget about pills, yeah,